Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Ask an Addiction Specialist. I'm Bob Weathers.
I'm Odie. I'm not a specialist.
You're great to have you. You're my foil, and I love our interactions. I want to welcome all of you back for part two of where we began last week. Our topic was using shame as the signal to the self, and we're going to be moving into how we can transform shame today. But before we do that, a few things by way of announcement. First of all, in honor of Austin here, my co-producer is Austin Armstrong, Franz Salvatierra. You've met Odie Martinez. These three guys keep things moving today and every day. And I want to encourage you to interact with us today online. If you're seeing this through the Facebook, you can leave. The Facebook group is Ask an Addiction Specialist. You can leave comments or questions as we go forward today, and I encourage you to do that. Also encourage you to reach out to friends and let them know about what we do every Wednesday. So happy to have you here. I wanted to say just a few things personally today, by way of context, as we move into talking about transforming shame. First of all, is that for the last almost 3 months, I've been in and out of pretty severe illness. I had, and I've talked about it here, I had shoulder surgery about 3 months ago, and unfortunately, about 6 weeks into that, I developed a very serious infection. It's referred to as sepsis, and it kills people. 1 out of 3 people that get sepsis die, and 1 out of 2 people that have it as bad as I got it die. And so I'm glad I'm in the half that live.
Yeah.
I'm really grateful for that. But I know that there's been some times I've missed in the last few weeks, and it's really owing to illness and just recuperating from the sepsis. The good news is that they went in and did a second surgery on my shoulder, the same shoulder that had the first operation, is rotator cuff. And they removed much of the infection, including with the pins or the anchors that were into my shoulder. So the good news is that I'm alive. The bad news is that my shoulder's back to square one. So my orthopedist in the last couple of weeks suggested that we consider a third surgery, at which point I strangled him. No, he's no longer with us. So at any rate, we're going to wait on the third surgery for right now. But I wanted to share that as a backdrop to something that I brought in today, is that this past Monday, 2 days ago, was my birthday. It's my 63rd birthday. It's particularly poignant to me because I'm alive. It's nice to celebrate your birthday alive, and I'm really grateful for that. Yeah. And I received a lot of gifts, including from people that are involved in Facebook community and other communities that I'm involved in. And I received a card, and she doesn't know I'm going to comment on this, but it was easily one of the most touching gifts I could have received. And I want to share with you, one of our weekly participants who is also very gracious in sharing questions and comments is my dear friend Angela. And I want to thank Angela for this incredibly thoughtful card that she sent. I hope that you can see this. It includes on the front a poem by the Persian poet Hafiz. Can you see that okay? Oh, hold it closer. That would mean that I have a shoulder that can, okay, there we go. It's a really beautiful card. Hafiz was a contemporary of Rumi in terms of Persian poetry that continues to live into the 20th century. Both of them are poets that are widely read in the United States, which was pretty crazy when you think they originated from Turkey and Afghanistan. Right. Anyway, the cover of this card, in case you couldn't read it, is "There are so many gifts still unopened from your birthday." That's from Hafiz, Hafiz. There are so many gifts still unopened from your birthday. And Angela, I want to thank you. The card really touched me, and the comments that you made inside. And I'll tell you, one of the places that the card went for me, it went a lot of different places, very moved by this, was, I already talked about my gratitude for being able to celebrate my 63rd birthday, is that whether it's you, Angela, or me, or any of us as human beings, we all struggle with different kinds of enslavement. Yeah. And as we've talked before, enslavement is the English root of the Latin term for addiction. Well, I'm getting that all backwards. The Latin term that addiction comes from is addictus, and addictus in Latin simply means slave. Yeah. So addiction means to be enslaved, and we all know about different kinds of enslavement. In fact, most of us if we're not addicted to substance, are addicted or include other addictions to various behaviors. You've been very generous, Odie, and it meant a lot to me for you to share some of your own struggles with enslavement.
Yeah,
and I've wanted to be transparent with you about ways that I think that we're all in the soup together on this. It means a lot to me that you do that.
Thank you.
And in the context of that, Angela, and to all of our listeners, I really do feel like the poem is apropos of all of us. I take it personally and really appreciate it. But there are so many gifts still unopened for all of our lives. And one of the things that enslavement does, whether it's in relationship for you with your wife or you and your career, Odie, and the same for me, is it keeps those gifts under a bushel basket and they don't get expressed. And so when I sit today, right before I come here with the group at Beginnings Treatment Center of the Men, who I love so dearly, the goal there is to, I'm going to start crying because I feel this so deeply. The goal there is to do whatever we can to remove barriers or impediments to your gifts being expressed, my gifts, their gifts. Yeah. And so I think the poem is really a birthday poem for all of us. I was also thinking, Angela, that it's very timely because I'm coming up, well, let me make an announcement, is that next Wednesday we will not be meeting.
Yeah.
And I came in today, and everyone here in the studio thought that that was today. So we are meeting today, Austin and Franz and Odie, here we are. And these guys are amazing. We went from no studio to like here we are on air within a few minutes. It's crazy. We will not be meeting next week, and I'll tell you why, is that I've been invited to address the American Pharmacists Association next week. They have their annual conference. It happens to be in Salt Lake City. I'll be flying to Salt Lake City on Wednesday and will not be here. I'll be flying out about the same time that we'd be meeting, in fact. And I want, many of you have read about this. I put a post on my Facebook. My Facebook is under Robert Weathers. That's my given name. And you can find this post there if you're interested in reading more of the details. But every year, the American Pharmacists Association includes an institute on alcoholism and drug dependency, and they've invited me to present not one but two workshops, which I'm incredibly honored to be involved in this. The first one is on today's topic. The first one is the title of it. They supplied the title. I supplied the content. The title is Finding Grace. And it's an introduction to addiction and recovery. And the material that we've been talking about here, especially for the last several weeks running on shame, we'll be talking about grace today, is directly pertinent to this presentation. So next Thursday morning, I'll be doing the kickoff workshop of the whole conference. Will be on Finding Grace, which I think is incredible.
Yeah, that's great.
The very next day, I'll be doing another workshop on how to integrate family resources in terms of family therapy, for example, with addiction counseling, particularly from 12-step support groups, and how do these two twin resources communicate to one another and work with not only individuals in recovery like myself, but also our family members, our loved ones, and how do we integrate that therapy? It may sound like kind of a boring topic. I find it really fascinating because there's all kinds of collisions that happen between the worldview of most typical recovery workers, addiction counselors, and those of therapists, particularly family therapists. And I'm really wanting to provide a bridge. In fact, that's the title of this particular presentation. Again, given to me by the American Pharmacists Association, and then I get to be creative with it. The title of this is Bridging the Gap. And we're really looking at bridging the gap between the right hand and the left hand here. How can we provide services that are complementary and not antagonistic? So I'll be there next week, and it just so happens, I thought of this, Angela, I'm thinking of you and your birthday card, is that next week while I'm presenting at this American Pharmacists Association will be my 6th birthday of recovery, beginning June 1st, 2012. Nice. That's my recovery date, and I find that really timely. I'm going to remember to mention this when I'm up there in front of 400 pharmacists all around the country, is that how synchronistic, how beautifully providential it is that I'm in this situation on my birthday.
That's awesome.
So there's different birthdays.
Yeah.
There's this birthday, thank you very much, Angela, and there's next week's birthday, which I'll be celebrating with a whole room full of pharmacists. There's a funny backstory. When I was in high school, my first part-time job was working at a pharmacy, the local pharmacy. And I grew up in Central California. I lived in Visalia. It was Mixtures Pharmacy. And I loved that job. I could work it around my other involvements. I was active in sports and in music and had a girlfriend and was involved in church. And they had a very flexible schedule. So I worked there for 2 or 3 years, at the end of which the pharmacist Bob Pullen said he'd like to send me to pharmacy school. He'd gone to USC, University of Southern California here in Los Angeles, and he got his doctorate in pharmacy. And he says, I'd like you to become a doctor of pharmacy. And I contemplated that for a while. It was really quite an honor.
Yeah.
Instead, I decided to get into psychology, and there's a whole other story there. But I've always had this deep affection for pharmacy and for pharmacists. And so there's something about me being invited by this organization to speak to them, which I've never spoken to before. Certainly spoken to psychologists and psychiatrists and mental health workers, marriage and family therapists and so on of all stripes, which I love doing. But this will be an interesting group to be speaking to, and it's really full circle for me.
I was about to say,
So,
that's really full circle.
Yeah, we can go back almost 50 years to when I worked at Mixter's Pharmacy in Visalia, and I feel very honoring of the memory of Bob Pullen and Harold Fink were the two pharmacists there, so I'm very happy to be coming back. That's great. They'd be happy for me, I'm sure of it.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit of a backdrop for today and for the last week and for next week as well. So join us today then. Odie and I will be completing what we started last week, which was introducing the idea of using shame as a signal to the self. We talked about how it is, I'm just going to review real quickly some of the high points. We talked about how it is that there are gifts in shame. The only way that it makes sense to talk about gifts and shame is to differentiate our definition of shame, to make a distinction between what some people call healthy shame, which I prefer to call rightful guilt. I think one aspect of when we do something wrong and feel bad, I think that's important. I think it's important that we feel that, and I think of that as rightful guilt. And we'll be talking more into that today for sure. Versus, on the other hand, what some people call unhealthy shame, which I call toxic shame. And so when I use the term, just to cut to the chase, when I use the term shame and guilt, that's the distinction I make.
Yeah.
And as we talked about last week, in fact, the group before we came in here today, I asked for the definition, and one of the gentlemen in the group gave the same definition, and it was basically, shame tells me that I am 100% a foul up, and guilt tells me that I fouled up.
Right.
And that distinction makes a huge amount of difference. We talked about that last week. If we can learn how to separate what I've done from who I am, that's an important piece. And why does that matter? Is that shame, in terms of the biology of the brain, shame actually activates the freeze response. You've heard of fight or flight reaction. It's actually fight, flight, or freeze.
Right.
And it's a midbrain phenomenon, which basically, when shame kicks in, it actually shuts down or usurps the frontal cortex, which is the part of us that makes moral decisions. So ironically, if I'm ashamed, I won't be able to correct my moral indiscretion. If I've stepped on your foot, for example, shame won't permit me to acknowledge that I stepped on your foot.
Right.
In fact, it'll keep us in a ruptured state, whereas guilt moves me towards you, shame moves me away from you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
With shame, we want to crawl into a hole, and that's really what the brain does. It just shuts down. It wants to freeze. It wants to play dead.
Right.
And guilt is a social emotion where, with guilt, I apologize to you and I also commit to you that I won't do it again. And so it moves me towards you.
Yeah.
So you can see why this distinction isn't just semantic. It's really important behaviorally. So we covered that last week. We had tons of questions and comments coming in. I'd be happy to entertain comments and questions today with Odie here. But where we left off last week was the very pregnant question, Franz, what's to be done? What's to be done about this shame that afflicts us and that can paralyze us? What do we do with that? Well, I want to unpack that today, and we'll have another exercise today as well. But I want to start by unpacking that by referring to the 20th century German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer. The significance of Dietrich Bonhoeffer is not only was he one of the leading intellectuals of the first half of the 20th century, he was a theologian and academic, a professor in, I believe it was in Bonn in Germany. I can't remember for sure, but that's what comes to mind. And the poignancy of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's story is that he was profoundly Christian, a pastor as well as a theologian, and with the rise of Hitler's power, but I get the chills with this every time, Bonhoeffer became part of the resistance to the Third Reich, and he actually was involved in establishing a plot to assassinate Hitler.
Wow. And
one of the painful chapters in all of the Holocaust and World War II is that Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his Confederates, they were all discovered in the weeks right before the end of the war. I mean, it's literally right down to the end of the war. Their assassination attempt was foiled. They were discovered, and they were all executed within just a week or two of the liberation of Europe. And Hitler committed suicide during this time, so they were executed. And it's a double pain. It's painful to see that they were executed for doing what came to be seen as the right thing, and then secondly that the world was deprived of his genius for the next 50 years, because he was in his prime. You can see in the photograph that I have here. There's a photograph. He was a young man and made a huge impact. He wrote scores of books. When I was in graduate school, I took a number of courses on Bonhoeffer. I was quite captivated by him. I took one whole course that just focused on the ethics of Bonhoeffer, and that's what we're going to talk about today.
Sounds good.
So, Bonhoeffer made a distinction between what he called cheap grace and costly grace. And I want to unpack that today in the context of what you and I have been talking about, Odie, and look at it from a psychological frame. He establishes it more from a theological or philosophical frame, and both are relevant here. So what Dietrich Bonhoeffer calls cheap grace, he has a book called The Cost of Discipleship. And in this book, he elaborates this distinction. It's a very powerful book. And you don't need to be Christian to get tremendous value out of it, because it's an inspiring book in terms of living from a deep ethical center. He was profoundly Christian, and he uses Christian metaphors. It's a very powerful book for sure. And in this distinction between cheap grace and costly grace, I want to start by discussing what he means by cheap grace. In cheap grace, it would be my stepping on Odie's foot and having no guilt. In other words, there's no rightful guilt. I should rightfully feel guilty for doing that. And so if I ask you for forgiveness, oh, I'm so sorry, and don't have any intention of changing that, and you forgive me, that's what he means by cheap grace.
Okay.
So I have no intention of changing. I'm asking you for forgiveness. Forgiveness is hollow at that point, right? It's like, why would I forgive you, Bob? You're going to step on my foot again. and all of us are human beings that have asked for forgiveness, or maybe forgiven ourselves when we have no intention of changing. This comes up a lot in the frame of addiction. In fact, it came up today in our group where one individual said that as part of his addiction, he struggled with turning the ship around in terms of his behavior. And I said the difference it makes is your intention. If your intention is to change your behavior, addiction is extremely challenging to turn that around, because it is self-perpetuating. There's an inertia to addiction, biologically as well as psychologically. But if your intention is to turn that around and to recover, even if there are mistakes along the way, if you pick yourself up and continue onward, that's the key. And I said, all of us in this room, including myself, have said to loved ones, I won't do that again, knowing full well that we will do it again. That would be cheap grace. That would be asking for cheap grace. Whereas if I've hurt you or wronged you, and there's no active addict that hasn't betrayed trust, hasn't hurt, hasn't lied, etc., is that if I'm fed up with that, and I'm going to do all that I can in my capacity to change my life, then I can come to you and I can say, I'm really sorry that I've done that. I'm doing all I can to not do that again. Please forgive me. And that moves us then into the second conversation, which is talking about costly grace. Costly grace, this is the Bob Weathers mathematics of this. Costly grace equals rightful guilt. So now I feel rightfully guilty for having betrayed or hurt you. And it's minus toxic shame.
Okay.
What makes it costly is it includes guilt. What makes it grace is it eliminates shame. I don't believe that shame, to put this in a theological frame, I don't believe that shame in the way that we're talking about it is of God. I believe it is by definition toxic. On the other hand, I do believe that guilt, the prick of conscience for both of us, I do believe that is of God. I think there's a still small voice inside of us that serves us tremendously. And so it won't do to miss that, nor will it do to be sunk by shame. It reminds me of something when I talk about guilt. When I meet with the young men and women that I meet with each week, and we talk about what it was like to be in active addiction, what's striking to me, I'll ask them a question based on my own experience. I'll say, when you were in the throes of your active addiction, maybe getting ready to use, going to procure your drug, whatever, did you have some experience, I'll just call it a still small voice, did you have some experience of conscience coming in and scolding you? And what's amazing is in a room of, let's say, 25 young men and women, most everybody will raise their hand.
Wow.
There'll be exceptions, but those are the exceptions probably to the rule that prove the rule, actually. And so what's amazing to me is even in active addiction, I certainly know this myself, there would be some part of me that would just go, don't do this. That was the voice of guilt.
Yeah.
And typically what would happen is that when I used whatever I was addicted to, alcohol and other drugs, it would reduce that. And this is something that we talk about in the rooms that I work with, is that most people, when they run into toxic shame, I'll say, how do you deal with that? And they go, I resort to my addiction, whatever it is. If it's a behavioral addiction or a substance addiction, because none of us can tolerate the heightened anxiety, the heightened stress of shame for very long. And so anybody that's been addicted, one of the top stress researchers in the world is John Briere, and he refers to this as, he calls them tension-reducing behaviors, TRBs for short, tension-reducing behaviors. Well, there's nothing that activates more extreme tension in terms of human emotions than shame. The research is in, and of all the human emotions, it kicks up our cortisol levels the highest.
Right.
It makes you the most stressed out. It makes me the most stressed out. And so I'll come up with these TRBs, tension-reducing behaviors. They can literally be behaviors in terms of, we talked about sexual addiction here, gambling, food, work. The list goes on in terms of, the list is actually quite infinite. I can turn to those to reduce behavior, television watching, whatever, internet, and or I can turn to my substance. And whatever substance I'm addicted to, by definition, at least early on, results in tension-reducing behavior. And it's hard not to do that. So you get this vicious cycle with shame, which is I'm ashamed. And so I take my drug of choice, whether it's a behavior or a substance, to reduce it, which only exacerbates my shame, because what am I doing? I'm doing shameful behaviors.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I'm caught in that, so I'll do more of my addiction, and so there it goes. And so, as I talked about last week, the poor get poorer, the poor get poorer, and that's one of the ironies and painful tragedies of addiction, it seems like to me. So, let's unpack cheap grace and costly grace here, and then we'll do an exercise.
Sounds good.
With cheap grace, with costly grace, let me try this differently. With guilt, the next slide, I need some help from. with guilt included, rightful guilt, which now we're talking about costly grace. When I've hurt you, I feel bad about it, and I'm willing to be vulnerable with it. I'm sorry that I hurt you, and I'm sorry for your hurt. There's an openness, there's a vulnerability, and also with it, as I've talked about, I'll vow to change. I'll vow to change, and I've got to do that with sincerity for it to be real. And only then do I come to you with humility and ask for forgiveness. And so I'm affected by what I've done, by the hurt it's been for you.
Right.
I'm not okay with my having done it. I want to change that. And at that point, I come to you. That would be costly grace. That would be costly grace. And as I talked about before, it keeps the heart open. I'll move towards you with that. That's costly grace, rightful guilt plus minus toxic shame. But what happens with when I'm overwhelmed by shame? With shame, I will have hurt you, but I can't get close to, I can't open myself up to the hurt that you've been caused, nor can I open myself up to the fact that I'm the perpetrator.
Right, yeah.
Shame will keep me away from that. Remember, it makes me want to sink into the floor.
Right, yeah.
There's no way that I'm going to want to hear your pain. There's no way I'm going to be able to be with you in your pain, because after all, I'm the one that caused it. So that's part of the problem. I can't be vulnerable with you.
Yeah.
And the fact that I hurt that, I'm the cause of that, makes me feel bad about me. That's what shame is. I'm a foul up. I'm 100% foul up. I didn't foul up. I'm a foul up. So I'll feel bad about me, so bad that I'll give up. I'll give up trying to change, because you know what? If I'm defective, why bother?
Yeah, exactly.
We've talked about this before.
Yeah.
There's no hope. If you're a complete flub up, or me too, then all is lost for us. So I won't vow to change. And so the only thing I can do is come to you and ask for cheap grace. I can't come to you sincerely by owning up to it, because why? It actually makes me feel more ashamed. I feel so ashamed by what I've done. Why would I open my heart to you and say, yes, I did it? And so I'll deny it, or I'll minimize it, or I'll blame you, but I won't own up to it. So what we're saying here today is that, and this is in the tradition of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, is that there's no forgiveness possible in a state of toxic shame.
Okay.
The two are mutually exclusive. If I'm in shame, I cannot really ask for forgiveness, and there will be no costly grace. There will only be cheap grace, which means there's no guilt involved in that. So, A, you don't feel me getting close to you because I'm not being vulnerable, and B, you have no hope for me to change because I'm not saying I'm going to change.
Right.
How can I change something I didn't do?
Yeah.
Right? That's what shame says. I didn't do it. I'm innocent. I'm innocent. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I was gonna say, is that similar? It almost sounds like pride.
Yeah.
In
I
a sense.
think it's another way to put it. Pride would be a defense against shame.
Yeah.
In a way that I think that you're meaning it.
Yeah, exactly.
What does the Bible say? Pride cometh before a fall.
Yeah, exactly.
Because right underneath pride, it's a veneer over my vulnerability, over my shame.
Yeah, exactly.
And so this is always confusing to me as a kid because I looked up to adults and looked up to bigger guys on the playground and so on like that. They seem like to have it together.
Right.
It took me a long time to realize that we might say that there's a healthy pride in your accomplishments and so on.
Yeah.
The kind of thing that gets us involved and ambitious in our lives. I think that I just talk about in terms of healthy self-esteem.
Yeah.
But you can suspect that there's a fly in the ointment. You know, if there's something off with that. If my pride is like Teflon and won't allow for any imperfections. Any imperfections, and so that kind of pride is a defense against the deeper feeling. And so what you're seeing, which can manifest as arrogance or imperviousness, I'm impervious to hurting anybody, can itself be a very kind of fragile veneer that if you keep going out that, then I'll probably attack you, or I'll leave you. Is that I won't let you mess with my defense because what's underneath that is so overwhelmingly negative to me, and I can't possibly go there. So part of what we're talking about in this whole series, in fact, not today and not next week because Bob's going to be in Utah next week, but the following week, Austin and Franz. I'm just teasing. I didn't let them know about today, so I think everybody was surprised. We'll be coming back in 2 weeks, not next week, but the following week, and I want to do an exercise, which we've done before, but never in this context, about going right into what it is that people don't want to do. In other words, we're going to be going right into shame. How do you transform shame? We're introducing it today. This sets up the podcast-long exercise we're going to do in 2 weeks. And honestly, if you don't have any tools for dealing with it, it makes sense to me that you'd resort to pride or some other defense, denial, etc.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Shame silences a crucial message right at the heart of guilt. And then what's the gift of guilt? If we can talk about it that way, I think we can. Guilt makes me sensitive to you.
Right.
I'm not insensitive, I'm sensitive to you. Guilt humbles me. You talked about pride.
Yeah.
The opposite of pride would be humility.
Yeah.
Guilt keeps my heart open in terms of caring for you. Shame shuts that down. And we talked about wanting to correct my behavior. Guilt will lead me to want to change. And shame paralyzes that reflex. I can't correct what's not wrong.
Yeah.
You know? So it keeps me isolated. In fact, it keeps me isolated not only from you as my friend, it keeps me isolated from myself. And so I end up living with this kind of divided self.
Right.
As I said earlier, active addicts, right in the heart of their addiction, there's some part of them that feels bad about it, but they can't stop it.
Yeah.
The same as the same as I've got same and shame going on here. The same is for shame. That is, try to say that 4 times in a row. Okay. The same is for shame. That is to say that if I feel ashamed, I can't possibly get close to that. And unless I'm a sociopath, that is to say that I don't have any feeling at all of rightful guilt inside.
I was thinking that too, that you want to feel some form of guilt.
Yeah.
Because other than that, then
Yeah.
I'm guessing you're in trouble if you feel no guilt.
I had somebody a couple weeks ago say it, put it this way in the group. He said, what about sociopaths and narcissists? And I said, with sociopathy, that's the definition of that is a lack of guilt,
Right.
a lack of caring, a lack of there's no remorse in somebody that's sociopathic. That's somebody who can kill you and smile about it and go eat lunch right afterwards. It doesn't affect them at all. And that's a serious condition. It's a very small percentage of human beings that have that, but it's of concern. There's another one, disorder or emotional problem that refers to narcissism. There's a lot more evidence of narcissism for sure than sociopathy. But with narcissism, I will manifest with that boastful pride that you were talking about. but I have the capacity for some guilt. If you
Okay.
dig deep enough, if you dig
Yeah.
deep enough. With a sociopath, you don't. You
Yeah,
don't. There's
not there at
nothing.
all.
There's nothing there.
Wow.
Hope springs eternal, and I believe that for people that work, for example, in the prison system,
Uh-huh.
that's there. It is possible for people to make a change in terms of beginning to feel guilty.
Yeah.
But I think it takes doing what we're talking about, which is opening your heart, and that can take a long time to do that.
Yeah.
And I think it's one step forward and two steps backwards a lot in prison systems, because you don't think of a prison situation as being something that would encourage vulnerability.
Yeah,
You've got to
exactly.
survive, so I'm
Yeah.
going to open my heart. You got to be kidding me.
Yeah.
So there's a problem built in there. But I think that hope springs eternal for all of us. And so whether it's narcissism or sociopathy, we're not talking about that extreme right now. We're talking about you and me,
Right.
Cody,
Yeah.
and what we can do to change our lives. And so one thing I know for sure is that to the extent I'm locked in that kind of pride, narcissism, not being able to accept guilt, that's to the extent to where I'm cut off from you and I'm actually cut off to parts of myself. So I end up being only show you the prideful part, let's say,
Right,
which
yeah.
means that's half of Bob or whatever. That's not all of me.
Okay.
Okay, so we're at a place now to talk about an exercise for today. And Odie and I are going to do this, and I haven't pre-prepared this with you or me, so we're going to do this on the spot.
Sounds good.
Can you think of an instance in your own life where what we've been talking about in terms of toxic shame, where you felt so ashamed of something that you had said or done, or maybe not done, maybe even something that you thought, where you couldn't make yourself vulnerable in order to establish a foundation for forgiveness? And by that I mean, it would be like, I've harmed you, and I know that I've done that, and I feel so bad about it that I cannot resolve this with you. I can't discuss it with you. That's one piece of forgiveness.
Yeah.
There's another piece, which is the flip side of that in some ways. If that's the social side between Odie and me, the personal side is I can't forgive myself either. And so something so shameful that it cuts you off from others and it cuts you off from yourself. So I'd like you to pause for a moment, give you a moment right now to reflect on this. I'm going to do this too. And then Odie and I'll share, God willing, and the creek don't rise. And we'll come right back. Okay. You have something?
Yeah, I think I can give a general example.
Why don't you take a stab at it, and I'll share something too, but I'd love to hear
Sounds
from you
good.
first, okay?
Yeah.
Let me interrupt for just a second. As you listen to Odie and me, be thinking about how this goes for you. I encourage you to write down whatever it is that you've experienced, and if you'd be willing to share, your experience in a way that also protects you, I want to be mindful of that. I want that for you and me too, Odie, to share something so that because we're talking, if we're going to be vulnerable, the Latin root of vulnerability is the word vulnus, which means wound. So we're going right into the heart of a wound. And I want us to, you're here with friends with Austin and Franz and Odie and Bob, but I also would like you to be protective of yourself in a positive way. But if you're willing to share how this has gone for you, or how you respond to what Odie and I share, I encourage you to send in a comment, and Austin will moderate that, okay? So the question is, can you think of an instance where shame shut you off from forgiveness? And start with you, Odie.
Okay, yeah, I sometimes where you're married, if you're married, anyways, you're gonna have arguments with your wife, so those spring up, and the only thing I could think of right now was there's moments and times where I do have a disagreement with my wife, and I know that I was at fault for the argument that sprung up.
Yeah.
And like we've mentioned before, the pride, the shame of knowing that I was wrong.
Yeah.
I want to say I'm sorry for
Yeah.
doing that,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
like that shame
Yeah.
side of me is just like,
Yeah.
no, well, you know what? Here's what she did.
Mm-hmm.
So you shouldn't say sorry first. You should wait for her to say sorry. And
I have a thought here.
Yeah,
and I
go
want you
for
to
it.
continue. Is if any of you don't know this experience, then you are lying. I actually chuckled as you were talking because I identify with it so strongly.
Yeah.
And anybody in intimate relationship with loved ones, family, friends, husbands,
Yep.
wives, sons, daughters, fathers, mothers, all of us know this, that you're tapping into
exactly.
universal, and I love what you're saying. So I want you to continue. I just wanted to say that, take back my comment about liars. That wasn't very nice. I'd like to just include all of us. You're not alone, my friend. Okay, all right, keep going, please. Yeah.
But that's pretty much the ending of it. Is that, you know, a part of me wants to say that still small voice says you need to say sorry first, you know, because you know you were in the wrong. But the prideful, the shameful part of it keeps you away from opening up and saying, you know what, just, it's a little weird. It was weird at first for me, but practicing more and more, it helped to get to that point where, like, okay, take a deep breath. Here we go. I'm sorry for what I did. Yeah, you know, but
it's funny. I was going to ask you, what do you do? And you're talking about it. Is that if you think about it for just a second, this is Odie's brain on shame. This is Bob's brain on shame. Is that shame will shut us down. And so the thing that you know, there's some part of your brain, some part of you, that's saying, I need to say I'm sorry to my wife.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's overridden by the shame. It's a good example. We talk about how the frontal cortex, which is the part of you that's moral, and realizes that you're wrong here. Yeah. You started it. You started the argument. Is that part, the frontal cortex, is actually hijacked by in between our ears, the midbrain, which is what we're talking about here in terms of where shame resides. It will shut down the frontal cortex, and so you can know it, but you can't act on it. Yeah. And I liked how you put it. You say you take a deep breath, take a step back. And with some time, I was going to ask you how that goes, because with time what will happen, generally, not always, but generally, is that there'll be a relaxation of the midbrain, and the frontal cortex can come back on mind, and you can do what was unthinkable 5 minutes before. Yeah. That makes sense?
Yeah, that's exactly what happens. I still struggle with it, but, you know, nobody's perfect, obviously, but definitely a lot better than before. Yeah. And what I've also noticed, too, is that it shifted as well. You know, at first, I wasn't like that. My wife was more that way. She would apologize first. Even though I was the one at fault, she would still be the first one to admit what she attributed to the argument. And so that, me seeing that from her, that I started to see, okay, I need to start doing that, because that's just the right thing to do. You know, that's the... what was it? Not the cheap grace, but the other grace.
The costly grace.
The costly grace. Yeah. So
I love what you're saying. It feels like such an honoring of your wife. I love the root of the word angels. I thought your wife was such an angel, and it really comes from the Greek root angelos, which just is a messenger. She's like a messenger of a deeper truth, and what we're calling costly grace, which would be.
I like that.
Yeah, I do too. She modeled it for you, and I love how you just honored her in that now. You honor her by naming the fact that she modeled that for you as long as she did. And if you've got your eyes and your heart open, eventually it begins to transform you. This is what happens in our loving relationships, ideally. And you began to risk doing something that might have been more alien. I think in some ways it's gender related. I don't think that we boys growing into manhood have much modeling necessarily for for saying I'm sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
We talk about this with the men that I meet with. It's okay to say that you're pissed off and hit somebody, but you don't admit that you're sad.
Yeah.
You don't admit that you're afraid, and you never admit that you're ashamed. You just don't do that. And I'm not saying that that's easy for girls growing into womanhood. I think, and my guess is that times change, but relatively speaking, I think all of us have a difficulty with it. And I think in some ways boys are socialized in such a way that to go to these more vulnerable, these more vulnerable emotions is so counterintuitive. And in your case, it took somebody, in this case your wife, who could model being vulnerable, and you began to risk being that with her. And it's transforming you. And it continues. It's not ever done, is it? The same for me. The same for me.
Very well put.
No, I really appreciate you sharing that. I hope that those of you that are watching can find some relatedness to what Odie said. My earlier comment about liar, liar, pants on fire, is that he's talking about a universal. He's talking about a universal for sure. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
I feel similar. I feel like it'll just be reinforcement of what you just said. I know that for me, early in recovery from a growing addiction and chemical dependency on both alcohol as well as sedative medications, that was where I was at the end. I was out of control, And what I couldn't handle, especially from loved ones, those closest to me, was any guilt tripping. I should actually say shame tripping. It's come up with a new word, shame tripping, because there are those that shame tripped me.
Yeah.
And in hindsight, I can look at this, your wife is going to shame trip you or mind me if they're scared. It's very understandable. They're scared because who am I married to, or what's going to happen? In my case with addiction, is Bob going to die? It's threatening to the very core of the relationship. And so we talked earlier about how pride can be a defense against shame. Shame tripping, blaming somebody, coming on heavy with judgment can be a defense against the vulnerability, which is I'm scared to death. I'm scared to death of what's happening to our relationship. And so early on for me, I was very vulnerable to shame from the outside. And part of what made me particularly vulnerable is that I was already a shame pod in toto. I was just one big shame ball. And I felt horrible. I've shared here before, but I felt so ashamed that I was sure you were judging me.
Yeah.
And so if you did anything to confirm that, which would be like blink your eyes every 5 minutes or something, that was, now he doesn't, he's judging me. So I mean, it didn't take you doing squat for me to judge myself. And that's really what shame will do. It's like a black hole or the Bermuda Triangle. It will suck everything down into it.
Yeah.
And so my shame made me extremely vulnerable to any tone of voice, any comment at all. And so I readily owned that I was shame prone for sure. And what followed up on that shame was just feeling like I was blowing apart into fragments. And so there's no way I could get close to guilt.
Yeah.
And it took me the longest time. It took me about 9 months of early recovery to move through what is referred to as post-acute withdrawal syndrome, which means I was like a roller coaster in terms of emotions. And one of the prominent emotions for me was anger. I was irritable a lot. And it ties back into your comment about pride. Anger is another defense against shame. Why is Bob so angry?
Yeah.
Well, because to be tender and vulnerable and to admit to him being wrong is completely undoable for him. So he'll just go around being pissed off. And so I bit off a lot of people's heads during that time. Not happy about that. And as you said with your wife, Odie, for me it began to relax for me in my relationship to Colleen, relationship to my daughter, and relationship to people that were close to me in my life. I began to be able to admit to it. Something that helped me, and I talked about this today in our group at Beginnings, is for my own involvement was being involved and engaged in support groups. And for me, that was AA. The 12-step groups provide a format. I also was involved at the same time with Refuge Recovery, which is mindfulness-based. Smart Recovery is another resource. There are a lot of resources. Al-Anon. There are a lot of resources. And what's common across all of these groups is that you have to be able to talk about what you did wrong. The expectation, if you come into group and tell a prideful story, you'll get shut down. Or if you minimize, in the case of addiction, if you minimize that or minimize the effect it had on people that are in your life, the social support is for you to be real, to be vulnerable. And doing that meeting after meeting, several meetings a week for a period of months and then years, right up to the present, it made it possible to do something that I'd never done before, which is to be vulnerable with others, with my faults, and to begin to realize, there's years ago I studied ancient Greek, and I was in a seminary, and we were studying the language of the New Testament, which was written in ancient Greek.
Right.
And we learned the word that's translated in the New Testament. In fact, it's attributed to the words of Jesus, the word for perfect. Perfect. So, for example, Jesus says, "Be ye perfect as I am perfect." And there's an interesting little caveat here, and this is what I want to get to. The Greek word is teleos for perfect. And in the context of ancient Greece, they had an interesting meaning. And so when I asked the group today, I said, what do you guys think of when you think of perfect? Perfect is without, and people said, well, without sin, without blemish, without imperfection. It means to be all shiny. And I said, that's true. That's right. When we think of perfect, perfect means not imperfect. And it's just very interesting. In the ancient Greek understanding, which is the language that, for example, St. Paul used in his epistles in the New Testament, those are written in Koine Greek, ancient Greek. And he used the term perfect as well as the gospel writers. And when they use that term, the word teleos means complete. Means complete. And so perfection in the sense of completion. And so whether it's attributed to Christ or the New Testament or just an understanding, it's a very counter understanding to our tip. When you and I use perfect, we use it in a way that's understandable, but that's not the ancient Greek concern. And so it leads to a misinterpretation of some central passages, for example, in the New Testament, for example. And the idea of to be complete would be to be doing what you do with your wife, which is to be complete with your wife is to come in and to be, I'll use the word imperfect in all the ways that you are. And the greater perfection, the greater completeness is for you to be vulnerable in the mistakes you've made, submit or surrender those to her humbly, and then to have her engage with you, ideally in a reconciling or a forgiving kind of way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's perfect sense. That's
different. Yeah,
great.
perfect
Yeah,
sense.
yeah.
It makes perfect sense. Yeah.
What was the Greek word? Teleo?
Teleos.
Teleo sense.
Makes perfect in a teleos sense. Yeah, yeah. I think it's a way to talk about perfection in a way that invites all of us. If it's true that the latest study says that 90% of us have at least one behavioral addiction going on right now, 1 out of 4 of us have a substance, we're clinically addicted to a substance, a psychoactive substance, whether it's alcohol, nicotine, or other drugs. And so that's 1 out of 4 Americans over the age of 12 are clinically addicted, which is like mind-boggling.
Yeah.
But what's even more mind-boggling is that 90% of us acknowledge that we have at least one behavioral addiction in addition to that. So I can be addicted to alcohol and also have multiple behavioral addictions. Wow. And so for all in the soup together, this latter understanding of perfection really pertains, is that what would it be like for me to begin to own up to what I've done to you as a function of addiction? Because if I don't let that out, if we don't reconcile you with your wife, me with mine, those with our loved ones, then we're left with shame and secrecy. And what do I do to feel better when I'm ashamed and secretive? What do you do? Well, chances are that we resort to tension-reducing behaviors.
Yeah.
In any other word, that's addiction, addicted behaviors. And so you can see the vicious cycle, and the only way to break that is to break it. And so it could be helpful to have an expansive notion of perfection. We mean perfection this way.
Yeah.
I've got a final image here that I want to bring up right now, and it's of the sword and the stone. You all may be familiar with it. It's the myth of Excalibur from the Arthurian legends. And if you watched any kind of depiction, including Disney, of the Excalibur, King Arthur, he's boy Arthur, is given the task of removing a sword from a stone. In fact, whoever does this will obtain magical powers. It's a myth. And as the story goes, he was able to put his hands on this as a boy and do something that no other grown man had been able to do, literally to pull the sword Excalibur out of the stone. This image came to me in the last few weeks as applicable to this conversation. And the way that I understand this is, what if we would look at guilt as the sword? Guilt is the sword. And the stone, what it turns our hearts to stone, is shame. And is there a way, we're talking about costly grace, we're talking about you with your wife, we're talking about me with mine. Is there a way that I can pull the sword out of the stone, that is, own the guilt that I have? I've got the chills as I'm talking about because it runs so deep, and pull it out of the stone that would only harden my heart. The way that you talked about your process, Odie, is identical for me and for our viewers. Is there a way to redeem ourselves by pulling the sword? That's what's rightful. That's what we owe our loved ones. But not to be sunk by the stone, because the stone will pull us down to the depths. Yeah. And so I've got a homework assignment for all of you who are viewing today, being ever the teacher Bob. Can we commit this week? Odie, your example is a perfect example. Can I commit to trying to pull the sword out of the stone this week with someone that is close to me? As you put it earlier, in our closest relationships, it's impossible to rub up against each other and not have at least mini ruptures, M-I-N-I ruptures. They happen all the time, these little ruptures. Yeah. And the only way to repair them is to own up to them. So we're talking about repairing these ruptures that happen inevitably in our most important relationships. Quick aside here, when I've had clients over the years come to see me, couples come to see me, and they say, the only person I have a problem with is with my husband or my wife. And my response inside is, well, duh, because it doesn't matter with people that don't matter to us, or it matters far less. Yeah. So if it's the grocery clerk, I'm far less likely to get upset about that in most circumstances than I am by somebody who's much closer to me.
Yep.
The exception to that would be if I never express my anger at people that I love, then I'm liable to displace it onto the grocery clerk or the gas station attendant, or you can go down the list. And I think of the image of kicking the dog. It's a gross image, but it's like, you know, the kind of stereotypical image of somebody kicking the dog who's do nothing of that kind of abuse, owing to the fact that the person has no place to vent the anger. And so with that exception, then the people that yank our strings, the people that really get us going, get us activated emotionally, are those closest to us. And so with those, we have plenty of opportunity to do Bob Weathers' homework this week, which is, could I take a step in the direction of what Odie suggested today, or what Bob suggested, which is pulling the sword of guilt out of the stone of shame? So what we introduced last week, which is using shame as a signal to the self, and what we've talked about this week in terms of transforming shame, and the only way to transform it is to understand it. And to understand it means that we have to divide up shame from its toxic aspect, its unhealthy aspect, which pulls us down. That's the stone. To differentiate that from the sword, which is related to rightful guilt. Guilt will connect me with you. It does you with your wife.
Yeah.
It's being able to say I'm wrong. That's owning up to feeling guilty, feeling bad about that, and we should feel bad.
Right.
The example I have is if this is a hot stove, I want to have feedback, such as my hand moves away from it. It should hurt.
Yeah.
Well, guilt is the same way. It should hurt you to hurt your wife. It should hurt me to hurt those that I love as well. And so that pain, there's no way to sugarcoat that. Guilt hurts. But that's a whole different level than shame. Strangles off the life impulse. It'll shut us down. We'll freeze. And so is there a way for me to use rightful guilt as a signal to healing? And when toxic shame comes in, what can I do to heal that? Well, that will be our next conversation. It won't be next week, so this isn't literally accurate, Franz. I apologize to you. It'll be next week. Next week squared. 2 weeks from now, we'll be looking at self-forgiveness practice, because what I want to do, in addition to what you're talking about, Odie, which is reconciling with in this case, your wife, by owning up to your responsibility, that is to take ownership for your guilt. Right. I want to find a way then, because I think it begs this question in our conversations here. What do I do with the shame, that big stone that the sword is locked into? What do I do about that? And I feel like they're almost like a surgeon with a scalpel, which I know a lot about with my shoulder. These last few weeks, I've got scars over my shoulder from people digging around in there. Well, hang with me. Is that like with a surgeon with a scalpel, there's got to be skillful means by which we can go right into the heart of shame, which is the most loathsome emotion to all of us human beings. There have got to be skillful ways that we can move into it to actively change or transform shame. And that's where we're going to go in 2 weeks, okay? So that's today's presentation. Any final comments from you, sir?
Looking forward to the self-forgiveness practice.
Me too. Me too. It's my favorite part of all of this work. And I'm looking forward to it because it has the potential for changing. I'll say this much, and I've mentioned this before here. For the last half a dozen years, starting back June 1st, 2012, I've practiced what I'm going to be doing, what I'll be sharing in our podcast. I practice that almost every morning. There have been some gaps in there, but almost every morning. And so, for example, this morning, as with most mornings, part of my quiet time includes just 5 minutes that's focused on what we're going to talk about here. So we'll be spending an entire hour podcast session kind of doing and then unpacking this practice, but it only takes 5 minutes, and I do it every day. You're going to love the irony of this, and you'll get this, is that most of the time it's with those closest to me. So, for example, the biggest bulk of my self-forgiveness practice, which involves asking for forgiveness as well as granting it, not only to the person who may have wronged us, but also to ourselves who've done the wronging. The biggest percentage of that is those closest to me. This morning it was with my wife, and probably 3 days ago it was with my wife. And that's as it should be. It's those people that are going to be the ones that we need to kind of keep. The way I think it is keeping the pipes cleaned out. I want to keep that cleaned out. And so I do this every day, and I'm going to introduce something with the hope that, if you're working out, and let's say that you and I want to get stronger. Okay. I introduced this today in the group at Beginnings, is that there's a man there who is obviously really attentive to his body and his strength and so on. He works out regularly. And I looked at him and I said, if I came to you and I said, I'd like to work out and build some muscles and I'd like to just work out once a month, he just burst into laughing. You go, yeah, right. Well, I feel that around what we're talking about is the practice that you're talking about with your wife. It requires weekly processing to
Yeah.
keep things worked out. There's a family therapist up in Washington, John Gottman, and I believe it's attributed to him, so I'm going to give him credit for this. He says there's 3 things that every couple, every committed relationship, you can include family relationships here. There's 3 things that you should do on a weekly basis. He says one is to share positives. I appreciate this about you.
Yeah.
The other is to share constructive criticism. I need us to work on this. This isn't working for me. And the third is to share paranoid fears. I just love that.
Yeah.
It's a thing. Talk about vulnerability.
Oh.
I'm afraid that you don't love me anymore. That kind of thing is a paranoid fear. To air that so that stuff doesn't get clotted up in there, so that you can keep the river flowing. And so in that spirit, to do what you talked about with your wife is very much a part of that. How do I keep things cleared out? You hurt my feelings. I think I hurt your feelings. I'm worried about being vulnerable because I'm not sure that you'll love me if I expose my vulnerabilities for what I did, and then have her dispense grace. And so we're talking about that in relationships, and we'll be talking about that also with ourselves. What can I do to keep myself cleared out? And this practice that we'll be introducing next week is something you can practice. And back to the metaphor of building muscles, it won't happen if you do it once a year or once a millennium. It could make a difference if you do it daily.
Yeah.
Or most often daily. And I am like exhibit A of that, because I can guarantee you that if you met me 6 years ago, I would not be able to tell you my story as I'm able to do it now. And that's attributable to a lot of things. Support groups, people that love me, people like Angela that send me really affirming cards and have so much love. I so appreciate that. These people, your wife, people in our lives that really matter to us, that support us. And also, I think, are developing skillful means, which would be the practice we develop. I think that if we can develop positive habits that are some combination of the best of spiritual traditions and the best of what contemporary psychology has to offer, and practice these daily, it gets to where it transforms you almost at a cellular level. Just like working out does. This is like a workout for the soul. And so we'll be introducing that next week. I'm really looking forward. This is the high point of this whole series for me, what we're doing next week. So.
Sounds good.
I said next week. I meant next week.
Yeah, next.
So we're going to see you in 2 weeks. Any final questions, comments from our audience? I know that you were wowed by today's presentation, hence the relative silence, but I don't want you to give up, nor does Austin. So you can write Austin, you can write me through Facebook. You can leave a question there. You can also access our YouTube videos. We've archived now about 30 of these podcasts. I'm very appreciative to Franz and Austin and now Odie for moving us forward with these. We have a whole archive of really rich material. I introduced this today to the men that I was meeting with in the group at Beginnings, and there's turnover because people get better and they move on. And this group wasn't aware of this podcast, and they were excited about the fact that they can access this no matter where they move back to, wherever they're from in the country, and they can access this online. And there really is a lot that we've covered during this time. We've had guests on here. We've had regular guests in the last number of weeks with Odie. We've had other guests come in that are quite expert. And then you guys have engaged with me, so we have a dialogue ongoing. And so I encourage you to review this and other podcasts online at YouTube or at Ask Addiction Specialist or at Beginnings Treatment Center. All of those have repositories, and you can submit questions there. Finally, let me suggest that you're welcome to go to my website, which is just basically a clearinghouse for information on addiction and recovery. The whole thing is dedicated to it. And I'd love for you to access that. And you can send me questions there. You can send comments and questions to me directly from my website. It's www.drbobweathers.com. And there's a contact me portion. In fact, you can get my address and do as Angela did, which is you can send me cards. No, I really appreciate this. And it came to my address that's online. So thank you all. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you, Odie.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Franz. Thank you, Austin. And happy birthday to all of us. Yeah. I really want to leave with this idea that what we're talking about doing, and you talked about this in your relationship, we're talking about opening up the gifts that we are and being able to free those up. And the thing about this kind of information is that it does free us. If shame enslaves us, if shame paralyzes me, what will free me is transformative information. And what we've set up these last several weeks with you and me, Odie, leading to what we'll be doing in 2 weeks, is beginning to practice something that will liberate us from enslavement. It liberates me from what I'm doing by these kinds of conversations and this kind of practice is I'm reducing relapse risk. And how am I doing that? It's not any kind of mysterious thing. Yeah. If I can reduce stress, and including stress about being imperfect and not knowing when somebody to find that. That's just cash in the bank.
Yeah.
Anything I can reduce stress is going to reduce relapse risk. And so that's what we're doing here. And the good news is that what that does is that as relapse risk and addiction are reduced, it liberates me more and more for you to be Odie, for me to be Bob. And in that spirit, then let's all bring our gifts to the world, okay, by increasing liberation. Thank you all. You all take care, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye for now.